You were there. You were fed, held, sung to, probably dropped once and never told about it. Someone celebrated the first time you rolled over. Someone cried the first time you said a word. It was, by every account, one of the most important years of your entire life. And you remember none of it. Not the sound of your mother's voice before you knew what a voice was. Not the first time you saw your own hands and didn't understand they were yours. That entire person, the one who lived inside your body for the first 2, 3, 4 years, is a stranger to you now. You have no access to him, no access to her. So here's the question that's going to bother you for the next 9 minutes. Where did that memory actually go? Because here's the twist. It might not be gone at all. The first person to give this a real name was Sigmund Freud, back in 1899. He called it infantile amnesia, and his explanation was very on-brand for Freud. He figured we repress those early years because they're tangled up with primal urges we're not supposed to look at directly. For decades, that idea just sat there, mostly unchallenged because who was going to argue with the guy? Then neuroscientists actually started looking at baby brains instead of theorizing about them. And what they found had nothing to do with repression. It had to do with construction. Specifically, your brain in those early years was a construction site, and you cannot store a memory in a building that isn't finished yet. Deep in your brain, there's a structure called the hippocampus, and it does something remarkable. It takes the raw chaos of your experience and files it into something you can retrieve later. Think of it less like a hard drive and more like a librarian, constantly cataloging. In a baby, that librarian hasn't been hired yet. The hippocampus is one of the last major brain structures to fully mature, and it keeps developing well into your early childhood. Some research says, into your teenage years. Which means, for your first few years of life, experiences were happening, but nothing was around to properly catalog them. But wait, if the librarian wasn't hired yet, why does a 2-year-old clearly remember what happened yesterday? Why can a 3-year-old cry about a toy that broke last week? If the system's not built, how is any of that possible? This is where it gets strange. Young children do form memories. Ask a 4-year-old about their birthday party from 2 months ago, and they'll tell you, in surprising detail, who was there and what cake it was. Ask that same child the same question 10 years later, and it's gone. Not fuzzy, gone. Multiple studies have tracked this exact pattern. Children who could describe an event vividly at age 4 lose access to it almost entirely by the time they're 8 or 9. So the memories were real. They were formed. They just didn't survive. Which raises a much more unsettling question than, why can't babies remember? The real question is, what is it about becoming an older child that erases what a younger child already knew? Here's a piece of biology that sounds like it should make things better, but actually makes them worse. Your brain, especially in early childhood, is producing enormous numbers of new neurons, a process called neurogenesis, particularly in a region of the hippocampus called the dentate gyrus. New neurons sound like a good thing. More brain cells, more capacity, right? Except researchers studying this, including a widely cited set of experiments on mice by neuroscientist Paul Franklin, found the opposite. Flooding a young brain with new neurons doesn't preserve old memories. It appears to physically overwrite the circuits those memories were stored in. The new cells wire themselves into the same networks the old memories were using. And in doing so, they scramble the very connections needed to retrieve them. In other words, your brain wasn't failing to save your early memories. It may have been actively demolishing them to make room for growth. If this were purely about hippocampal wiring, you'd expect the amnesia to lift the moment the hippocampus matures. It doesn't. And that's because there's a second ingredient nobody talks about enough: language. Memory researcher Catherine Nelson has spent decades showing that children don't just need a working hippocampus. They need words. Specifically, they need narrative language, the ability to string an experience into a sentence with a beginning, middle, and end. We went to the beach. I found a shell. It was orange. Before a child can build sentences like that, an experience is just a sensation, a flash of light, a smell, a feeling of being held. It has no shape. And a memory without shape is almost impossible to file away for retrieval 15 years later. which means the real fog of infantile amnesia isn't just a hardware problem, it's a formatting problem. Your brain was recording in a language it hadn't learned to write yet. There's a third piece, and it might be the strangest one. To remember something happening to you, you first need a concept of you. Psychologists test this with something called the mirror self-recognition test, putting a dot of rouge on a toddler's face and watching what happens when they see themselves in a mirror. Under about 18 months, most babies reach out and touch the mirror, like there's another baby in there. Somewhere around 18 to 24 months, something clicks. They reach for their own face instead. That's the moment a continuous sense of I starts to switch on. Before that switch flips, there isn't really a stable narrator to hang memories on. Experiences were happening to a body, but not yet to a self that could claim ownership of them later. So maybe the question was wrong from the start. It's not, why can't you remember being a baby? It's, there was no you yet, in the sense you mean it now, to do the remembering. Here's where it should start bothering you a little. If your earliest sense of self didn't exist until roughly age 2, and full narrative memory capacity doesn't stabilize until somewhere around age 7. What do we actually mean when we say, I was born in this hospital, or I took my first steps in that living room? You don't remember any of it. Every single fact you know about your own first 2 or 3 years came from somewhere else. A parent's retelling, a photo, a video, a story repeated at enough family dinners that it hardened into something that feels like memory, even though it never was one. Which means a genuinely strange percentage of your personal history isn't something you experienced. It's something you were told you experienced. And you can't tell the difference anymore, because the feeling of remembering and the feeling of having heard a story enough times are neurologically almost identical. This isn't hypothetical. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus built an entire career demonstrating how easily false memories can be planted, showing that people can be led to vividly remember childhood events, like getting lost in a shopping mall that never actually happened. Not vague impressions, specific, sensory detail memories, complete with fear, with a description of the stranger who supposedly found them. None of it happened. All of it felt real. If a memory can be manufactured that convincingly in adults who have functioning hippocampi and full narrative language, imagine what happens during the exact years when your memory system is still being assembled, and every early memory is being handed to you secondhand by people who love you and have every reason to tell the story a certain way. Just when you think you've got the full picture, cross-cultural research throws in a curveball that biology alone can't explain. Studies comparing children across different cultures, for instance work comparing New Zealand children of European versus Maori descent, found that the age at which people's earliest memories begin isn't fixed. It varies by culture, and it correlates with something specific. How much a culture emphasizes detailed, personal storytelling about a child's individual past. Cultures that spend more time reminiscing with children in rich, specific detail. Remember when we went to your cousin's house and the dog knocked you over? Tend to produce adults whose earliest memories start earlier. Cultures with less of that narrative habit tend to have adults whose memories start later. Which means the wall of your childhood amnesia isn't just biological. Part of it was built or left unbuilt by the people who talked to you, or didn't, while your brain was listening. Let's go back to the twist from the beginning. It might not be gone at all. In 2016, Franklin's team ran an experiment on infant mice that should unsettle you a little. They gave the mice a fearful memory, let the normal infant amnesia process erase access to it. And then, using a technique called optogenetics, they directly reactivated the specific brain cells that had originally encoded that memory. The fear came back, instantly. The memory hadn't been deleted. It had been locked, not shredded. The mice could no longer find the door to it themselves. But the room was still there, fully furnished, exactly as they'd left it. Nobody has done this in humans, and there are enormous ethical and technical reasons why we may never be able to. But the implication sits there anyway, impossible to unhear. The version of you that existed before you could speak, before you knew you had a face, before you understood that you were a continuous thing moving through time. That version of you might not be dead. He might just be locked in a room you've lost the key to. which leaves you with something stranger than a neuroscience fact. It leaves you with a quiet problem about what a self actually is. You've spent your entire life assuming you're one continuous person, a single thread running from that hospital room to the chair you're sitting in right now. But the truth is, that thread has a gap in it. 2, maybe 3 years wide. And everything you think you know about what happened in that gap is secondhand, borrowed from other people's memories, other people's photographs, other people's version of the story of you. You are, in a very real sense, partly a work of historical fiction, written by your parents, edited by your own imagination, and footnoted with a few photographs that you've mistaken for proof. And maybe that's not a flaw in the system. Maybe that's the actual function of forgetting. You couldn't carry every raw sensation from the first 1,000 days of your life and still become a person capable of building new ones. Something had to be cleared to make room for the version of you that could actually use the space. So the baby you can't remember isn't a person you lost. He's the foundation the rest of you was built on top of. Invisible now, because you're standing on him. You were never trying to remember him. You were trying to remember someone who, technically, hadn't finished becoming you yet.